So we're going to be doing a few things today. I'm going to talk a little bit about an overview of Bowen family systems theory, and then we're going to discuss, there's actually 8 concepts in the theory. So I'm going to talk about one concept, which is family projection process, which I think is most relative to work with children and understanding of how systems affect the children we work with. And then there'll be an activity. So there'll be a little group activity. I just want to warn everyone. Participation is always appreciated. And then after that, we'll have some time for discussion. So let's get started. Okay, so this is Dr. Murray Bowen. Dr. Murray Bowen was a psychiatrist in the 1940s and 50s. That's when he began his research. He actually started out researching in psychoanalytic theory and did a lot of work with patients with schizophrenia. And what he noticed was, while he was working with patients with schizophrenia, at the time in psychoanalytic theory, it was discouraged to sort of engage with the family. It was more focused on the individual client. But he tended to sort of engage more with families. And this sort of led him to sort of be more curious about how the interactions within families and nuclear families affect the individual. So what he did was, he began a 5-year research project through the National Institute of Mental Health. And this research project was where he actually hospitalized entire families for a few months up to a year. So if you can imagine getting that covered by insurance today, I don't know, inpatient folks? Probably not. So he actually studied entire families, and what he noticed was children who had schizophrenia, he noticed that the mother and child relationship was almost symbiotic in nature, meaning that he had trouble identifying them as separate selves. It almost seems like they were like one person. And at first he sort of focused on the mother and child relationship, but later realized that the entire family played a role in sort of the expression of clinical symptoms in children with schizophrenia. So he started this idea that the entire family system actually played a role in symptom development in children. He was heavily influenced, I guess we can go to the next. He was heavily influenced by Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin, as everyone knows, came up with the theory of evolution. And similar to Darwin, so Darwin was sort of the linking humans to sort of the physical aspects of other animals and species, and Bowen's theory was sort of linking human behavior to that of other animal species, which was not exactly a popular theory at the time, to think that our emotional processes are related to other species, but that's sort of how he got started in his work. So in his theory, he came up with the idea that the way we act and behave is actually multi-generational, meaning that things that happened to our families generations ago are still in our DNA and still affect our behaviors today, which is pretty significant clinically if you think about it, because, for example, families that were maybe exposed to war or some sort of trauma, or, for example, slavery, what else, or famine, things like that, would affect your DNA and maybe even your behaviors and reactions in current generations. And there's also a whole field of epigenetics that also talks about this, but I don't know enough about that to go into that today. But it's really interesting to see how genes are expressed within families. There was actually a New York Times article recently, I'm not sure if anyone saw it, on the Dutch famine, which happened during the Nazi occupation. So they found that children who were in utero during this famine were actually 10% more likely to have an increased morbidity rate as they got older, and also were more prone to diseases like diabetes and schizophrenia. And this was a specific cohort of individuals who had that specific event happen to them at a certain time. So basically what he theorized is that just like animals, what happens to us is sort of programmed and expressed through our behaviors. Okay, so as human beings, we have a strong disposition to live in groups. We work together to accomplish complex tasks, and we have remarkable intelligence, maybe I don't know about all the time, but sometimes. So the building blocks of human social groups are tightly knit multi-generational family units. So So I don't know if anyone can see this. It says, ever the genealogist, Keith brings his family tree to class. So this is, my instructor from my Bowen systems course used a lot of cartoons, so I promised I would put a couple in today. So I don't know if this is funny, but there's only one other cartoon. So this is just a genogram based on what we would think a caveman would do. Okay. So the main goal of Bowen therapy is to reduce chronic anxiety, and how you do that is by facilitating an awareness of how the emotional system functions. So if you're working with an individual, you're not necessarily trying to change the family, or like most therapy, you're not trying to change the family, you're trying to have them gain a level of awareness of what role they play within the family, how anxiety plays out in their family, and how to sort of be more of a self, rather than trying to kind of change other people. So in Bowen Theory, he stated that like all animals, we seek attention and approval from people in our families, and we react to the expectations and levels of distress within our nuclear families. This is my second and last cartoon. So it says, well, here we are at the Grand Canyon, but as usual, Johnny just had to ruin the picture for everyone else. So there's little Johnny, ruining the family photo. So he's seeking attention from his family. So the emotional system affects most human activity and is the principal driving force in the development of clinical problems. Here we have the 8 concepts of Bowen Theory. Is anyone familiar? I'm sure some people are familiar with triangles, right? That's usually a pretty common concept. We're going to talk mostly today about family projection process. Triangles are part of that process, so we'll talk a little bit about that. And we'll talk a little bit about the nuclear family emotional process too. Any questions so far before we get into family projection process? No? Okay. Okay. The projection process follows 3 steps. So the parent focuses on a child out of fear that something is wrong in child. So at this point, there may not be a clinical problem or a physical problem, but the parent is either assuming or focusing on that child for some reason. So then the parent interprets the child's behavior as confirming the fear, and then subsequently treats the child as if there's something really wrong with them. This can be sort of physical ailments or also clinical symptoms. So in 2-person systems, so you can look at this as partners for our purposes today in families. So 2-person systems tend to have these 2 relationships. So you either have an over-functioning person in the partnership and an under-functioning, or you have a lot of conflict and distance in the relationship. And what Bowen Theory says is the way this gets resolved, so if there's too much pressure in a 2-person system, it will be projected onto the third, and that's how you get a triangle. Today we're just talking about projecting onto a child, but there's also, you can look at the third part of a triangle as addiction, as an affair. Work can be part of the triangle. Anything that relieves the pressure between a 2-person system. So a parent being overly involved with a child is harmful because the ongoing emotionally intense interactions over the years of his development program the child's well-being and functioning to depend heavily on relationships. So if this child is the recipient of the most pressure from the 2-person system, he will be preoccupied with his mother's attention, approval, expectations, and distress. And his mood and motivation will be linked to how his mother and others view him. So who is most vulnerable to this process? Most often it's children who are conceived during a stressful time in a mother's life. There could be, like if there's stress within the family, loss of a parent, things like that. Often if you're the first child, you can be more vulnerable to this process because you're the first part of the family. Oldest son or daughter, an only child, or one who is emotionally special for some reason, maybe reminds the mother of someone, or for some reason she takes a special interest in that child. So there are 2 main variables that govern the intensity of the process. So the degree of emotional isolation or cutoff from the extended family, or from other important others important in the relationship system. So if you have families who tend to be cut off from their extended families, there's more likely to be more of an intensity of pressure within that family, which could result in more children with clinical symptoms. So that's why in Bowen Theory, if you participate in the theory like I did, they encourage communication with with extended family members on both sides, and encourage you to sort of bridge cutoff, because it sort of reduces the anxiety within the family. And of course, the level of anxiety affects how intense these processes are. And the level of anxiety can change. There might be a time of crisis within a family where it's more intense. There might be times where it's more calm and less level of anxiety. So what does this child look like? So when we talk about the overly involved child, this might be the child that's projected on, versus the child who maybe is not as projected on growing up. So there's the overly involved child would be easily bored in school, possibly, looks for his mother for direction, might feel excluded by peers. Learning depends on the teacher's interest, prone to rebel or comply excessively, so either side of the spectrum, and may stumble with transitions to adulthood. A freer sibling, so one who is not as part of the process, is not easily bored, finds things to do. Relationships are less of an issue. They can learn from most any teacher. Neither a rebel nor overly compliant, and smooth separation into adult transition. Any reactions to this, or what do you guys think? Because a lot of you either treat, most likely we're treating the overly involved child, possibly, maybe less likely, but still possible. Any thoughts on this?
Trying to see where I fit.
Yeah, I know, I looked at that too. Yeah, any reactions to it?
I'm just wondering about families that move, because I'm from Ireland, so
Right.
my family is distance away. And in cases like that,
Mm-hmm.
when they move from one country to another country, is this more inclined to happen?
That's a
If
good
they don't
question.
have the extended family?
I mean, I guess when we talk about contact with a family, it doesn't necessarily have to be in person. So if you're keeping those relationships over the phone or however you do it, that might, might not affect it. Yeah. Anyone else? No? Thoughts? So, freer siblings, more involved versus freer siblings continued. One of the things I thought was interesting is they often find mates with equally unresolved attachment. So you might find yourself with a person who has like a similar level of differentiation or individuality within the family. And sometimes they have poorly defined life goals. So sometimes you might be working with someone who really doesn't know what direction to go in. They might be more vulnerable to clinical problems, so anxiety, depression, and they're prone to actually cut off from their family, to sort of cut off communication. So freer siblings have remarkably few clinical problems, and usually have more contact with the family, so they're not as affected by this. Okay. So who is familiar with it? Yes, Dr. Petty.
Quick question.
Sure.
You say prone to cut off from family.
Mm-hmm.
This is quite different than John Walkup talks about the inability to separate from the family.
Mm-hmm.
That these kids become dependent on the family becomes an enabler, particularly with regard to anxiety disorders and possibly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think with you're talking about the children who are more involved. They could become more, close to the family, for example.
So
Not
who's cutting off? The parents are cutting off, or
it's the child.
the child's
Yeah.
cutting off?
Yeah.
This is quite different than John Walkup's experience and what he's been describing.
Mm-hmm.
That problem separating from the family from emerging adults with anxiety kind of problem.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess you could argue that if you are emotionally cut off, it doesn't mean you have resolved, the process.
They're enmeshed,
Right.
and from what I remember about Bowen, having seen him operate in Richmond or wherever he was at,
Mm-hmm.
actually seen him work with groups of families,
Mm-hmm.
I thought it was more the connection to the family rather than the kid cutting off. But it's an interesting way of looking
Yeah.
at it.
Yeah. I guess it could also present different ways too, I imagine. Yeah. Okay, so is anyone familiar with Everybody Loves Raymond? It's a pretty popular show. Okay. So if you are familiar, you may have to help because we're now at the group activity time. So you may have to help out someone who isn't as familiar with the show. But what I'd like to do is, so we've been talking a lot about families, and actually this show is based on Ray Romano and his comedy of his family. So him talking about the relationships within his family, and I think it's a pretty good example of how problems present, and I think most of us can relate to the issues. So what I'd like to do is ask you guys to sort of look at his family with the lens of what we've just been talking about. So I have a little genogram cheat sheet where no one's being graded, so it doesn't matter if it's correct or not. You want to pass? Thank you. You want to pass? And what I'd like to do is I have a few clips. I'll set up a scene for you guys. We're going to watch a few clips. And then I'd like you to sort of think about what the relationships are in the family. It's okay if you don't use the Bowen language, just sort of observing the relationships and where you might think there's more of a focus on a child versus another, or marital relationships, for example, over-functioning, under-functioning, things like that. And we're going to look at some clips. Okay, so in this episode the episode is called The Angry Family of Everybody Loves Raymond. And in the show, there's Raymond and his parents and his brother and his wife Deborah and their 3 kids. So it's mostly Raymond's side of the family that's featured in the show. And they're at, I guess, sort of a back-to-school night where children are sharing, or maybe he's during the day at class. But their son Michael shares a story about his family, and then we're going to watch people's reactions from there. So the little child speaking is their son, okay? And he's a twin, and they're the younger kids.
Okay.
Yeah. That's all.
Michael, it's your turn.
Thank God. We go after this.
The Angry Family. The daddy was mad at the mommy. The mommy was mad at the daddy. The mommy and daddy were very mad at the grandpa. The grandma got mad at everybody.
Did not.
Wonderful.
The grown-ups were always very loud. It hurt the kids' ears. In the end.
Okay, this is part 1. Part 2, so the next scene is when Deborah and Raymond, they're having a meeting with the teacher about what just happened. So that's the second part.
You know, we do have
Okay.
counselors. Father Hugley is very good.
No, that's the last thing that we need.
Why do you say that?
Because then everybody's talking about it.
What are you? Why do you have to be so close-minded? You see, this is the attitude.
I'm not close-minded.
Ugh, what are you doing right now? This is who you are. Why can't you just talk about things, huh? Talk! You know, I have to say that you're actually exhibiting some of the very traits that seem to jump off the page in Michael's book. Who? You. Wait a minute. First of all, it's not a book. It's pieces of construction paper.
You sound a bit close-minded.
Hey. Eileen, married, I didn't just get a husband. I got a whole freak show that set up their tent right across the street. And that would be fine if they stayed there. But every day, they dump a truckload of their insane family dreck into my lab. How would you like to sit through two people in their 60s fighting over who invented the lawn? The lawn! And then the brother. I'm having a birthday. I don't even have a lawn. Raymond has a lawn. But you can't blame him when you see who the mother is. She has this kind of sick hold on the both of them. And the father's about as disgusting a creature as God has ever dropped on this planet. So why don't the kid write stories? I should be writing stories. My life is a gothic novel. And until you have lived in that house with all of them in there with you day after day, week after week, year after friggin' year, you are in no position to judge me.
Anyone ever feel like Deborah? Okay, and the final clip, the family does actually end up deciding to seek some counseling, so this might be where we come in. But they're at I believe, at the church with their Catholic priest doing counseling. So.
If I may, you mentioned, Father Hubley, that I was not included in that book, and that is a very astute observation. And I do believe that my unique position in this family, as that of an outsider, allows me to view this hodgepodge of life from a rather unique vantage point.
Top of a beanstalk?
And I do maintain that if anyone is to blame, Father, for this river of pent-up hostility that runs through this sorry bunch, like you know what, through a we know what, that person goes by the name of Raymond.
Oh, sit down, you dope.
He is and always has been the center of attention, the center of affection. He always gets the center chair in the kitchen. And this anger of which you speak from the rest of these poor souls stems from his unwillingness to share even the tiniest portion of the spotlight that shines without end on him. What are you doing?
What are you doing? Center chair. It's my kitchen. Get your own kitchen.
There you go. There you go. You see, because I only have a kitchenette and he loves it. Right? Rub it in, Raymond. No house for me. No wife, no kids, no lawn, no nothing.
Okay. Everyone ready? All right, so who's brave enough to go first and maybe talk about some things you discussed, some relationships you saw? I heard a lot of good discussions. Oh, yes, thank you.
So yeah, I think there was some ambiguity around the distinctions between hostile classifications.
Right.
I saw Frank and Marie as close hostile, so knowing a little bit about the show, there is this connection.
Right, yeah.
And they're definite boundaries. So I wouldn't consider it fused.
Okay, yeah, that's a good observation.
And then, but I would characterize Ray and Roberts as hostile.
Yeah, okay.
I haven't watched a lot of the show, but I don't remember seeing a lot of connection.
No, I think you're right. They sort of kind of reluctantly spend time together and argue and things like that, yeah.
And I think Ray and Deborah's relationship mirrors Frank and Marie's relationship.
Interesting, okay.
And then, Marie, I think it almost seems like there's an attempt to be fused with both sons. But then there's her desire to have them close, but then they kind of push away. So there's, Ray is definitely focused on, but she also focuses on Robert and infantilizes him in a lot of ways.
Right. Very good. Those were very great observations, actually. Yeah. Anyone else? No one else? Anyone look at overfunction or underfunctioner in the marital relationships? Like maybe Marie tends to if you watch the show, she tends to sort of respond to everything, every need or perceived need in the family, and the father just kind of sits there and makes sarcastic remarks. So he's he doesn't participate as much in the family as much as Marie. Do you guys come up with anything else?
I think Deborah perceives herself as an overfunctioner.
Okay. Yeah.
Right? There's something about how she perceives herself
Mm-hmm.
as well as how outsiders might.
Right. And she's sort of outside, if you're looking at triangles too, she's sort of on the outside, being the one family member that's sort of, the in-law of the group, even though she has her own family. She's more stuck in those dynamics. And she often has resentment towards her mother-in-law because Raymond is sort of so focused on, and she thinks that he needs to sometimes act like more of an adult and be more independent. So that's another observation. Anyone else? Yeah, Sonia?
I'm thinking about Frank's relationship with his sons. Would you, I guess, distant? I'm trying to think about that, whether it's hostile or just more distant.
What does everyone else think? Hostile or distant? No one?
I've seen the show.
Yeah.
I really sense the attention that Raymond gets from Mom.
Okay. Yeah, it's possible.
Actually, that was more positive. There's a little bit more of a boundary with the father. I mean, the father's style of coping with life is the sarcasm and kind of being out there, but he's connected to his sons, but just not as enmeshed with them, kind of thing.
So he might be the healthier one, you're saying? Right. That's a good observation, that he might actually have better boundaries than Marie does. It's just the way it presents, it looks differently, yeah. Nice. Anyone else? Does anyone use genograms in working with clients? Some? Yeah. Sometimes it's helpful, not only for you to see as the clinician, but also for the family to kind of see how their family looks. When I participate in the program, our genograms, we have to put them up on the screen and then talk about our families. So it's helpful to sometimes see physically where everyone is in your family. Anything else on Raymond? Everyone good with Everybody Loves Raymond? Yeah? Okay. So, what are the implications for practice? So, this quote says, "There is always the initial problem. Most families are referred with a diagnosis for the dysfunction. They think in terms of the medical model and expect the therapist to show or tell them how to change the child without understanding or modifying their part in the family system." This was sort of a provocative statement to make. I just wondered if anyone had reactions to that. The idea that, for example, when parents bring a child for treatment, I think we've all had this experience where they're sort of, in a way, saying, "Can you please fix my child?" When there's sort of more processes at play, and those are harder to get to sometimes. Does anyone have any reactions to this? Agree, disagree?
Completely agree.
Completely agree. Good. Oh, great. That's a good answer. Okay. So the usual psychiatric approach is to examine the patient, confirm the presence of the pathology with a diagnosis, and recommend appropriate treatment. So it serves to support the parental projection process in the family and to crystallize and fix the emotional illness in the patient and help make the illness chronic and irreversible. So he argues that if the roles in the family do not change, or if there's not an awareness of the systems affecting the client, that this can sort of lead to a perception and then sort of following through in the idea of a chronic illness. What do we think about that? Agree or disagree? What do people think? Yeah? Okay. So, I just want to take a moment to wish everyone a happy National Social Workers Month Since it is March and since I am a social worker, I just wanted to take a moment to say that. And I want to thank you guys all for your participation. Next up, there is a TED Talk. I know everyone's busy. I don't know how much time people have, but there is a very interesting TED Talk that talks about the biology, sort of a neurobiology of violence, and sort of a systems approach to thinking about how violence is sort of portrayed in human beings. And I think it's very relevant to sort of the times we're facing right now, where there is a lot of concern for violence and concern for human behavior and decision making. So I wanted to sort of see how everyone's doing first, and see if you're interested in watching this and having a bit of discussion. It's about 15 minutes. And then I think it would kind of generate some great discussion. So is everyone up for it? Yeah. I guess if you're not, you can leave. That's right. But it's really interesting, and yeah, we'll give it a start. And then I'd like to... Okay.
So look, Robert spent the last few years thinking about how weird human behavior is, and how inadequate most of our language trying to explain it is. And it's very exciting to hear him explain some of the thinking behind it in public for the first time. Over to you now, Robert Sapolsky.
Thank you. Fantasy always runs something like this. I've overpowered his elite guard, burst into his secret bunker with my machine gun ready. He lunges for his Luger. I knock it out of his hand. He lunges for his cyanide pill. I knock that out of his hand. He snarls, comes at me with otherworldly strength. We grapple, we fight. I manage to pin him down and put on handcuffs. Adolf Hitler, I say, I arrest you for crimes against humanity. Here's where the Medal of Honor version of the fantasy ends and the imagery darkens. What would I do if I had Hitler? And it's not hard to imagine once I allow myself. Sever his spine at the neck. Take out his eyes with a blunt instrument. Puncture his eardrums. Cut out his tongue. Leave him alive on a respirator, tube-fed, not able to speak or move or see or hear, just to feel. And then inject him with something cancerous that's going to fester and pustulate until every cell in his body is screaming in agony, until every second feels like an eternity in hell. That's what I would do to Hitler. I've had this fantasy since I was a kid, still do sometimes, and when I do, my heart speeds up. All these plans for the most evil, wicked soul in history. But there's a problem, which is I don't actually believe in souls or evil, and I think wicked belongs in a musical. But there's some people I would like to see killed, but I'm against the death penalty. But I like schlocky, violent movies, but I'm for strict gun control. But then there was a time I was at a laser tag place, and I had such a good time hiding in a corner shooting at people. In other words, I'm your basic confused human when it comes to violence. Now, as a species, we obviously have problems with violence. We use shower heads to deliver poison gas, letters with anthrax, airplanes as weapons, mass rape as a military strategy. We're a miserably violent species. But there's a complication, which is we don't hate violence, we hate the wrong kind. And when it's the right kind, we cheer it on, we hand out medals, we vote for, we mate with, are champions of it. When it's the right kind of violence, we love it. And there's another complication, which is, in addition to us being this miserably violent species, we're also this extraordinarily altruistic, compassionate one. So how do you make sense of the biology of our best behaviors, our worst ones, and all of those ambiguously in between? Now, for starters, what's totally boring is understanding the motoric aspects of the behavior. Your brain tells your spine, tells your muscles to do something or other, and hooray, you've behaved. What's hard is understanding the meaning of the behavior. Because in some settings, pulling a trigger is an appalling act. In others, it's heroically self-sacrificial. In some settings, putting your hand on someone else's is deeply compassionate. In others, it's a deep betrayal. The challenge is to understand the biology of the context of our behaviors. And that's real tough. One thing that's clear, though, is you're not going to get anywhere if you think there's going to be the brain region, or the hormone, or the gene, or the childhood experience, or the evolutionary mechanism that explains everything. Instead, every bit of behavior has multiple levels of causality. Let's look at an example. You have a gun. There's a crisis going on, rioting, violence, people running around. A stranger is running at you in an agitated state. You can't quite tell if the expression is frightened, threatening, angry, holding something that kind of looks like a handgun. You're not sure. The stranger comes running at you, and you pull the trigger. And it turns out that thing in this person's hand was a cell phone. So we asked this biological question: what was going on that caused this behavior? What caused this behavior? And this is a multitude of questions. We start. What was going on in your brain 1 second before you pulled that trigger? And this brings us into the realm of a brain region called the amygdala. The amygdala, which is central to violence, central to fear, initiates volleys of cascades that produce pulling of a trigger. What was the level of activity in your amygdala 1 second before? But to understand that, we have to step back a little bit. What was going on in the environment seconds to minutes before that impacted the amygdala? Now, obviously, the sights, the sounds of the rioting, that was pertinent. But in addition, you're more likely to mistake a cell phone for a handgun if that stranger was male and large and of a different race. Furthermore, if you're in pain, if you're hungry, if you're exhausted, your frontal cortex is not going to work as well. Part of the brain whose job it is to get to the amygdala in time saying, are you really sure that's a gun there? But we need to step further back. Now we have to look at hours to days before. And with this, we have entered the realm of hormones. For example, testosterone, where regardless of your sex, if you have elevated testosterone levels in your blood, you're more likely to think a face with a neutral expression is instead looking threatening. Elevated testosterone levels, elevated levels of stress hormones, and your amygdala is going to be more active, and your frontal cortex will be more sluggish. Pushing back further, weeks to months before, where's the relevance there? This is the realm of neural plasticity, the fact that your brain can change in response to experience. And if your previous months have been filled with stress and trauma, your amygdala will have enlarged. The neurons will have become more excitable. Your frontal cortex would have atrophied, all relevant to what happens in that 1 second. But we push back even more, back years, back, for example, to your adolescence. Now, the central fact of the adolescent brain is all of it is going full blast except the frontal cortex, which is still half-baked. It doesn't fully mature until you're around 25. And thus, adolescence and early adulthood are the years where environment and experience sculpt your frontal cortex into the version you're going to have as an adult in that critical moment. But pushing back even further back to childhood and fetal life and all the different versions that could come in. Now, obviously, that's the time that your brain is being constructed, and that's important. But in addition, experience during those times produce what are called epigenetic changes. Permanent, in some cases, permanently activating certain genes, turning off others. And as an example of this, if as a fetus you were exposed to a lot of stress hormones from your mother, epigenetics is going to produce your amygdala in adulthood as a more excitable form, and you're going to have elevated stress hormone levels. But pushing even further back to when you were just a fetus, back to when all you were a collection of genes. Now, genes are really important to all of this, but critically, genes don't determine anything, because genes work differently in different environments. Key example here, there's a variant of a gene called MAO alpha. And if you have that variant, you are far more likely to commit antisocial violence, if and only if you were abused as a child. Genes and environment interact, and what's happening in that 1 second before you pull that trigger reflects your lifetime of those gene-environment interactions. Now, remarkably enough, we've got to push even further back now, back centuries. What were your ancestors up to? And if, for example, they were nomadic pastoralists, People living in the deserts or grasslands with their herds of camels, cows, goats, odds are they would have invented what's called a culture of honor, filled with warrior classes, retributive violence, clan vendettas, and amazingly, centuries later, that would still be influencing the values with which you were raised. But we've got to push even further back millions of years, because if we're talking about genes, implicitly, we're now talking about the evolution of genes. And what you see is, for example, patterns across different primate species. Some of them have evolved for extremely low levels of aggression. Others have evolved in the opposite direction. And floating there in between by every measure are humans. Once again, this confused, barely defined species that has all these potentials to go one way or the other. So what has this gotten us to? Basically, what we're seeing here is if you want to understand a behavior, whether it's an appalling one, a wondrous one, or confusedly in between, if you want to understand that, you've got to take into account what happened a second before to a million years before, everything in between. So what can we conclude at this point? Officially, it's complicated. Wow, that's really helpful. It's complicated, and you better be real careful, real cautious before you conclude you know what causes a behavior, especially if it's a behavior you're judging harshly. Now, to me, the single most important point about all of this is one having to do with change. Every bit of biology I have mentioned here can change in different circumstances. For example, ecosystems change. Thousands of years ago, the Sahara was a lush grassland. Cultures change. In the 17th century, the most terrifying people in Europe were the Swedes, rampaging all over the place. This is what the Swedish military does now. They haven't had a war in 200 years. Most importantly, brains change. Neurons grow new processes, circuits disconnect, everything in the brain changes, and out of this come extraordinary examples of human change. First one. This is a man named John Newton, a British theologian who played a central role in the abolition of slavery from the British Empire in the early 1800s. And amazingly, this man spent decades as a younger man as the captain of a slave ship, and then as an investor in slavery, growing rich from this. And then something changed. Something changed in him, something that Newton himself celebrated in the thing that he's most famous for, a hymn that he wrote, Amazing Grace. This is a man named Zenji Abe on the morning of December 6, 1941, about to lead a squadron of Japanese bombers to attack Pearl Harbor. And this is the same man 50 years later to the day, hugging a man who survived the attack on the ground. And as an old man, Zenji Abe came to a collection of Pearl Harbor survivors at a ceremony there, and in halting English, apologized for what he had done as a young man. Now, it doesn't always require decades. Sometimes extraordinary change could happen in just hours. Consider the World War I Christmas truce of 1914. Powers that be had negotiated a brief truce so that soldiers could go out, collect bodies from no man's land in between the trench lines. And soon, British and German soldiers were doing that. And then helping each other carry bodies. And then helping each other dig graves in the frozen ground. And then praying together, and then having Christmas together, and exchanging gifts, and by the next day, they were playing soccer together, and exchanging addresses so they could meet after the war. That truce kept going until the officers had to arrive and said, we will shoot you unless you go back to trying to kill each other. And all it took here was hours for these men to develop a completely new category of us. All of us in the trenches here, on both sides, dying for no damn reason, and who was a them, those faceless powers behind the lines who were using them as pawns. And sometimes change can occur in seconds. Probably the most horrifying event in the Vietnam War was the My Lai massacre. A brigade of American soldiers went into an undefended village full of civilians and killed between 350 and 500 of them. Mass raped women and children, mutilated bodies. It was appalling. It was appalling because it occurred, because the government denied it, because the US government eventually did nothing more than a slap on the wrist, and appalling because it almost certainly was not a singular event. This man, Hugh Thompson, this is the man who stopped the My Lai massacre. He was piloting a helicopter gunship, landed there, got out, and saw American soldiers shooting babies, shooting old women, figured out what was going on, and he then took his helicopter and did something that undid his lifetime of conditioning as to who was an us and who was a them. He landed his helicopter in between some surviving villagers and American soldiers, and he trained his machine guns on his fellow Americans and said, "If you don't stop the killing, I will mow you down." Now, these people are no more special than any of us. Same neurons, same neurochemicals, same biology. What we're left with here is this inevitable cliche, those who don't study history are destined to repeat it. What we have here is the opposite of it. Those who don't study the history of extraordinary human change, those who don't study the biology of what can transform us from our worst to our best behaviors, those who don't do this are destined not to be able to repeat these incandescent, magnificent moments. So thank you.
Talks that really...
Okay. What did everyone think of the video? Any reactions, thoughts or reactions? One of the things I liked about the video is that I think often and lately in the last few years or so when you turn on the news, it can often seem pessimistic, that we're all doomed to perpetuate violence and be at war and have conflict. But I liked about what he said is that at any point in time, an individual can choose to sort of do something differently or choose to support or help another human being. And I think that's true for the work that we do, because often I think a lot of quote-unquote problems come into our offices or into our programs, and I think sometimes it gets difficult to sort of see, well, what's the positive outcome here, or how can we see positive change? So I think it's important to remember that that can happen at any point in time regarding human behavior. Did anyone else have a reaction to that video? No? Does anyone have any questions based on what we talked about today? Reactions? I have both books here. These are two of the books that are used, written by Dr. Bowen. I'd also be more than happy to talk to you about my experience in the program. I'm still participating in the program, still talking about my family. My family is often like, what do you say about us at this program? What are you talking about? So I'm happy to talk about my experience personally and also academically in the program. If anyone has questions, either now or yes. Sonny.
I have a question about the integration of the 8 concepts you talked about.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a set guideline for integrating them, or do they just kind of get woven into the process, or is it that you go in sequential order?
Mm-hmm. It's sort of woven in. A lot of the concepts, when you learn about them, sort of overlap and sort of are part of the next concept. So yeah, it's not necessarily chronological or a certain order that you follow. Yeah. Any other questions? No? Okay. Well, I want to thank you all for coming today. I appreciate you taking the time. I know everyone is busy and probably has a lot of things to get back to. And I just want to thank everyone for all the work that you do with our clients. And thanks for coming today. So thank you.